Hello, everyone. Welcome to the September webinar of the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems. I can see folks are streaming in, so we'll give everyone just a moment to get their sound together and to get oriented to things. And if you take a look at your chat box, there's lots of information there for you. I'll be running through this momentarily, but if you'd like to take a look, you can also scroll through the information there. You will find in chat right now a link to download a PDF version of the slides if you would like to follow along that way. There's information about captioning. And also some more details about how the webinar is operating, that it's being recorded, that attendees are muted, etc. And please do feel free to use chat throughout this webinar to communicate with the panelists and to communicate with other attendees as well. And Sabrina, our webinar extraordinaire, will repaste into chat the information I was just referring to. So keep an eye on chat and you'll see it coming in. And I see folks in chat who've just joined. They didn't quite pick up the last chat box, so stay tuned. It's coming in just one moment. So again, for those who are just joining, welcome to the September webinar of the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems. This webinar is an introduction to microboards. We are very excited to be having this conversation, very excited about how many folks have registered and expressed interest, and it should be an interesting afternoon. So please do keep an eye on chat, and I'll also run through some details here on the slides before turning things over to our presenters. As you all may know, this webinar is part of a monthly series of webinars offered by NCAPS. These webinars are free, open to the public, and they're really designed to highlight innovative practices and different angles and perspectives on person-centered thinking, planning, and practice. Our center, NCAPS, is new this year. It's funded by the Administration for Community Living and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And the goal of NCAPS really is to promote systems change to further person-centered principles and to make them not just an aspiration, but a reality in the lives of people across the lifespan, people of all ages, receiving services for a variety of disabilities, including older adults with long-term service and support needs. All NCAPS webinars are recorded, and that's so that we may archive them on our website. We encourage you to use the chat function throughout this webinar. When you do use chat, be sure, if you'd like to send a message just to the panelists, which will be myself, Bevan Croft, as well as our presenters, who I'll introduce momentarily, you can send a message to all panelists. If you'd like to send a message out to the whole community of folks tuning into this webinar, be sure to select all panelists and attendees. And as you have questions for the presenters throughout the webinar, please type those into chat as well. Because there are so many people registered on this webinar, we have everyone automatically muted, and we're really relying on chat to be our primary communication with you throughout the webinar. Towards the end of this webinar, we will have a Q&A. So after we've heard from the three presenters, there'll be plenty of times for questions. For folks listening in who'd like to read a Spanish language version of this webinar, there is live captioning in Spanish. The link is here on the slide, and also you will find the link pasted into chat. And we'll paste that link periodically, so if you scroll up or down, you should be able to find that link. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll leave a couple minutes for some evaluation questions to be completed real time, just to hear how this experience went for you. Just a couple more logistics. Once we finish with the webinar, within about 2 weeks, we will have a fully accessible version of the slides for you to download and share. We'll also have various other resources associated with this webinar up on the website. We do aim for 2 weeks, and the recording will also be on the website. This webinar is also being captioned, closed captioned, in addition to being captioned in Spanish. Okay, so I think that that's all of the logistics for today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to type them into chat, and either myself or Sabrina Jonikin at the Human Services Research Institute will get back with you. So again, my name is Bevan Croft. I am co-director of NCAPS. I am at the Human Services Research Institute, and I am very pleased to be introducing to you our speakers for today. First, we're going to hear from Christopher Honeycutt and team. Christopher was born and raised in DeKalb County, Georgia, where he participated in the inclusive public education system. In 2011, he graduated from the first cohort of the inclusive public education system. Currently, Chris lives in a condo community with his roommate and keeps busy with 3 part-time jobs. Chris established his Microboard in 2014 and holds regular meetings to review his path with community members who are interested in providing support and guidance for his self-actualization. Christopher has presented to audiences at local, state, and national venues, and now on webinars. His self-advocacy provides encouragement to empower the voices of others. After we hear from Christopher and team, we will hear from Stuart Rabin and team. Stuart heads a Microboard in southeastern Wisconsin. Having the support of a Microboard has provided Stuart a quality of life unequaled under other models. Stuart may not speak with words, but his demeanor touches people's hearts. Most days you'll find him out of the house, seeing, doing, and exploring. His hobbies are riding roller coasters and swimming in the pool whenever possible. Stuart's mom, Anne, is fortunate to be able to share his story to encourage others in supporting the person to be the center of focus. Anne is a member of the Wisconsin Microboard Association, an advocate for the caregiving workforce, and also supported self-direction. And after we hear from Team Christopher and Team Stuart, we will hear from David Weatherow. David is an internationally recognized leader in community living and self-directed supports. And David and his wife, Faye, invented the Microboard model and developed North America's first inclusive housing cooperative, the first family and consumer governed service cooperative, and a mobile lending library of alternative communications equipment and trainings. David and Faye shared their lives with a beloved adopted daughter who lived with significant communication, mobility, and health challenges until her passing in 2004. So we're really pleased to be able to welcome all of these speakers to share with you about Microboards. And I will now hand things over to Team Christopher.
Thank you, Bevan. Thank you, Bevan, for the invitation. Hello. Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I'm excited to share where I am today, thanks to the support of my loving family, friends, and members of Microboard. The journey begins. So my parents did not know about Down syndrome. They believed God had a vision. Our lives, that vision, including me, made together with them and my sister. Vision is more of an impact. A clear vision provides a sense of direction. A North Star that changes as we change over time. It influences all areas of life, including family, spirituality, physical, well-being, leisure, and work. The vision shaped my future. For me, the vision was to be myself at school and in my community with everybody else. It is important to say our family just believe there is a place where civility and spiritual is valuable. And yet, A special is valuable, and yet our fundamental belief is that people with challenges should be learning, working, worshiping, and having fun, living right in the community with others from the community. Lessons I learned from my childhood, like fair play is shown, also it's not shown, competition, skills, teamwork, making and being a friend, and power of humor. As a student, I went to class and learned amongst my classmates and volunteered in my community. We were on mission trips. Not lessons as a student, like typical classmates, I learned reading, writing, and math, and helping others and working in a team, giving back, striving and handling hard stuff. Through my experiences as a student, I began to realize my gifts, talents, interests, and skills, my effort is important, and my goals and my roles, and my involvement makes a difference. I came to understand I can learn, I can grow, and influence in other comes. Here's a picture of the Rolling Stones. The visions change. You know what the Rolling Stones sing. You can't always get what you want. My vision of becoming a Power Ranger didn't happen, but instead I earned a black belt in martial arts. My vision to go to Bay College. Instead, I went to Kennesaw State University in May of 2011. I graduated with inclusive post-secondary education program there. Now, you see, vision got our direction to this point. Let's learn more about the power of Microboards. There are applications to the Microboards. Know the interests and gifts, strengths, and dreams of the focus person. In Georgia, we use a tool known as a path. Determine who knows the focus person well and cares about the future. Invite them together. Groups helps to begin considering what to accomplish, of what time frame, and what priorities. Regular gatherings currently is about right to discuss and adjust plans. United teams and individual strengths to influences outcome to the Microboard. Voting members on and off the board are such business teams to keep fresh ideas. Here's a picture of my path of 2014. And here's a picture. Thank you. And here's the path of here's another picture of my path in 2017. As my path shows, faith and friendship are important to me. Here are a few friends of faith. Some typical questions you may ask about regarding Microboards. Does a Microboard replace the need for paying support and run the interface? I'm not gonna wait with that. How do you work up the courage to invite people to join the Microboard? How long do folks typically stay on the board? What do you think about finding new board members? What is the range of involvement of the Microboards member? From most involved to less involved. Do you know how the Rolling Stones and it's a song? You can look it up on the YouTube channel. If you try, sometimes you just might find to give what you need. I like to thank my parents, friends, and Microboard members, the Children Microboard Association, and the NCAPs.
Great. Thank you so much, Christopher, and for putting together that presentation and for sharing what your experience has been like. And now we are going to move from Georgia up to Wisconsin to hear from the Rabin team about what things have been like for Stuart.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are honored to be able to share Stuart's story. And we title our presentation, Finding a Way to Keep Our Promise to Stuart. We all made a promise that Stuart would have a good life. So this is a graphic map of the process of deciding to engage on the path of microboard building for Stuart and the things that we thought about and the reasons for starting a microboard. This is Stuart's journey. So he went at the top from home to public school, and then for a couple of years to residential school. Once he aged out from the residential school, we tried a group home and then an adult family home. And neither served his needs. So we said, we have to get creative and develop a space just for Stuart. It was based around what Stuart wants. Stuart's sister likes to say, it's always about Stuart. And in this situation, it was all about Stuart or all about me. And Stuart was telling us that he was bored, he wanted to reach his goals, he wanted to be physically active and be outdoors. He didn't want to be managed by a system or caseworkers. So we looked for a way to provide him with choice. We listened to him intently. We looked for quality, and we wanted to be accountable and people to be accountable to Stuart. And of course, ethical caregivers and ethical practices and things that were transparent that would help Stuart to thrive. So we challenged the traditional system. We pushed back against the system. We said no as a family and on behalf of Stuart to mediocrity, complacency, to being anxious and disappointed and having to justify Stuart's very basic human needs. So we had an aha moment where TMG, the management group for IRIS in Wisconsin, suggested to us that maybe one way to go about it was to start a microboard. So we gathered together his allies. We had lots of kitchen table conversations with the dogs under the table. And we started to hear yes. We heard yes from Iris. We heard yes from the family. We heard, most importantly, yes from Stuart's support team. We heard yes from the medical team. And then we reached out into the community to our other allies, Society's Assets, to David Weatherow, thank you, David, to Dee Yost, thank you, Dee, and the entire Wisconsin Microboard Association, to the management group, to the fiscal service, and also an accounting team. The planning process was difficult, scary, and long. We had to look at things such as the budget, best practices, how are we going to be transparent? Insurance issues, firming up our employee handbook, business registrations. And the way we did this was binders, 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 and folders. And then, of course, the Microboard bylaws. We also had to build a lot of in-house know-how. So today, Stuart's circle is surrounded by many people beyond his family. He has his family, paid supporters, folks in the community, his wonderful volunteer board of directors, and his temple congregation. What was critical to us was that we knew that the key to a good life for Stuart were going to be those people who came across his doorstep every day to care for him. And we worked really hard to build a super supporter team. We wanted this to keep our promise to Stuart of that kind of life that he wanted. We are very firm on having a commitment both to Stuart, but also to each other. There's a lot of flexibility within the care team, and we optimize everybody's area of talent and encourage their sharing of passions and hobbies, both with Stuart and with the rest of the team. We ask them to extend themselves to make relationships also between Stuart and their families and friends. And more importantly than that, we have a very solid understanding, common understanding of what our culture is. We also have invested in professional development for the team members, which goes beyond standard caring. So this is where Stuart is today. He's a happy guy. He is learning, he's growing, he's changing. He's getting the physical activity that he wants. He's walking and swimming. He's got relationship and many other wonderful things that are important to him. So we all have a sense of terrific joy. And this shows the sense of joy that we all have, that Stuart has, his family, and his supporters, but also people he comes across in the community are very impressed by what he can do and that he is out and doing things. So his caregivers like to say that, yeah, Stuart is living his best life, and we agree. These are some pictures of Stuart's excursions. Under the Microboard, he now attends plenty of baseball games and has figured out that he enjoys baseball games. He's been on the Chicago River with the Wilderness Inquiry. You can see on his face that he gets a lot of joy from being outside in the winter and in the summer. He just finished his 5th triathlon in the Try My Best triathlon, which is a walk, run, and swim for special needs folks who are children and young adults. He also gives back to his community by volunteering. He fundraised for the Kenosha Dream Playground Project. And I just want to point out in this upper left-hand picture, Stuart's looking back at something that's going on behind him. And this is his caregiver, Christy. And you can see on her face the love and the interest. It's a really good picture about the people who surround him. He also fundraised for the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and put together a walking team. He supports Kindred Kitties by donating wrapping paper, using his vehicle to pick up and deliver cat food. And most of all, he can play with his puppies in his own space in our home. He was not allowed to have dogs in other settings, so this makes him very happy. And finally, Stuart won first place in our Family Olympics this summer, and everyone is thumbs up. Of course, he did have ADA accommodations, but we were all very surprised. Stuart's favorite person is Mr. Rogers. And this is a quote from Mr. Rogers that is worth sharing. "Human relationships are primary in all of living. When the gusty winds blow and shake our lives, if we know that people care about us, we may bend with the wind, but we won't break. Fred Rogers. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Anne, and Team Stuart for sharing your stories as well. So now I will turn things over to David Weatherow to give us a bit more of a deep dive into the workings of the microboard model.
Sorry, I had to unmute there, and the unmute moved away for a few seconds. Team Christopher and Team Stuart have provided a really good underpinning for the spirit of this work. I'm going to talk for a while about the nuts and bolts because this can sound sort of very aspirational, but it's actually quite practical. Christopher and Stuart and their families and friends remind us that we all need acceptance and understanding, trustworthy companions, valued social roles, and many opportunities to contribute to the life and well-being of our communities. Families need lifelong trustworthy sources for continuity of care and creative solution seeking for their sons and daughters. We all need strong partners to help us create good lives on a day-to-day basis. Community partners and direct support professionals need understandable models for making meaningful differences in one person's life. And governments and forward-looking service providers need clear, sustainable methods for making supports more person-centered, family-friendly, and directed by the people and families who are being supported. All of us are aiming toward a common set of elements in a good life: autonomy and interdependence, a life that's rich in relationships, meaningful employment and contributions, valued social roles, a home of my own, financial security, continuity of care and advocacy, and person-centered supports, as well as the very specific interests and directions that are being expressed by the person. We try to achieve this and find ourselves sometimes surrounded by a world of programs, caseworkers and protective service workers, private or public guardians, traditional provider agencies, day programs, supported employment programs, sheltered workshops, group homes, supported living programs. And one of the ways that I've come to understand this cluster of things is that they're often disconnected from each other. They're separate enterprises, separate programs. So sometimes coordination among these efforts that are doing everything they can to support a good life for us are just not connected to each other. They're not working in sync. Over the last 20 years or so, the states, aided by CMS and other federal initiatives, have tried a number of different approaches to changing this picture. Right now, especially with the NCAP support, some states are working to re-engineer state-operated services and traditional provider agencies in the direction of more person-centered practices. This is important work and needs to continue, but it tends to take a great deal of time. It involves many moving parts, and the existing service architecture may be presenting some built-in restraining forces. Many states are providing individualized waiver funding to traditional service providers, but there's no guarantee that a given provider can operate in a way that's fully person-centered because of their own internal architecture, or that the provider can fully support self-direction. Some states may be providing individualized funding directly to people and their families, But these direct funds are often actually limited in amounts, and there are few safeguards in the event of a family member's incapacity or unavailability as people age. So we're also looking for continuity of support and practice. And finally, some states are engaging fiscal intermediaries to help those individuals and families manage direct funds and ensure an increased degree of accountability. But fiscal intermediaries often stand in the employer of record, making it difficult for the person or their family to adapt quickly to someone's changing needs or provide effective direction to support workers. There is, however, another robust person-centered option in which the state provides direct individualized funding to a small provider organization called a microboard. Microboards are small, nonprofit corporations, boards, that are designed to serve one person. They're designed to last a lifetime and still meet the state's needs for contract compliance, quality assurance, and public accountability. Faye and I created the first microboard over 30 years ago. This is a graphic that shows the elements of that first microboard. And when we started to share the story, that microboard inspired a movement as a number of people and families realized that the model would work for them. And several governments realized that they were working well for the people and they were working well for the government. So there are now nearly 3,000 microboards worldwide, including in British Columbia through the Vela Microboard Association, microboard associations in Wisconsin, Illinois, Georgia, Tennessee, Australia, the UK, more recently Norway, and elsewhere. Here's how it works on a practical basis. The state qualifies each microboard as a provider in the same way as it qualifies any other provider. So there's no special budget line for microboards and no special administrative line. The microboard creates a person-centered plan and submits the program plan and the budget to the state. The state establishes a contract with the microboard for specific services and supports. And the microboard provides the state with regular financial and program and outcome reports, and the state reciprocates with routine evaluation and performance and quality assurance reviews. We need both internal and external evaluation going on. So all of this can be done without requiring any changes in legislation, policy, regulation, or administrative procedures because the state uses the same administrative and funding and management structures as it does for any other agency. Like any other provider, the microboard employs and supervises direct support workers, buys goods, services, and specialized supports, and buys utility services like payroll and benefit plans and so on. But because they serve only one person, microboards have a number of important features that are actually baked into their architecture. Person-centered planning is baked in because there's only one person to plan for. Planning with the person and their families and trusted community partners is baked in. The person and their microboard control who provides support on a day-to-day basis. As one of the organizers of one of the statewide associations said, you get to control who comes in your front door. The supported person is a full member of the governing board, receiving whatever supports he or she needs to effectively express their sense of direction. Microboards strongly encourage and support and thrive on the active involvement and engagement of other community partners. And these partners can offer invitation and membership in the community spaces in which they have standing and influence and greatly expand the person's connections and opportunities. I'm going to tell you a very short version of a longer story. A friend of ours, we have permission to share this story from both parties. A friend of ours was on my board of directors, and partway through the year, a new board of directors member came into our board meeting and got to know Scott And at a break in the board meeting, they were having the kind of conversation that people often have when they're first getting to know each other, which is, what do you do for a living? And Al said, I'm a corporate lawyer. Scott, what do you do? And Scott said, I put together earphones for Air Canada, because he was in a little sheltered workshop that did that kind of work. Al said, how do you like that work? He said, I don't like it very much. And he explained why that was. And Al asked the $64,000 question. He said, Scotty, what would you love to be doing? Scott said, radio. I've always wanted to be in radio. And people in the formal service system had been telling Scott for a number of years that he couldn't really be in radio because his arms and fingers were very different, and he couldn't cue records. He couldn't put the needle down between songs on the records, and he couldn't see very well, so he couldn't see the spot between the records. Well, Alan didn't know that, but he did know a guy who owned the radio station, and he said, Scotty, I know a fellow who owns a radio station. Maybe we can have coffee with him and see what emerges, see what we learn from that. And he called his friend in the radio station, and he said, Jack, I've just met a young man, who's becoming a good friend, named Scott. And he'd love to have an opportunity to learn and explore about the radio business. Can you come and have coffee with us and just help us think about this for a while? And that turns out to be a very powerful question. We've asked it probably in 100 different instances, and nobody has ever turned us down on that. So Scott's been working at the radio station for 30 years now. It's part-time work, but he's absolutely a member of the radio station family. And that's how this works. Rapid adaptation and response is baked in, including the fact that because the microboards don't own the houses that people live in, the person can move to another house without losing their supports, or choose another provider without losing their home and their place in the community. Continuity of care and relationships and representation are baked in because people are always bringing in new partners. Competition between and among people who are being supported is zero, and staff and management turnover is demonstrably reduced. Microboards don't do this in isolation. They're almost always developed and supported by local or regional or statewide microboard associations that provide training and development and representation, and sometimes co-op benefit plans and technical assistance. So it makes it possible for microboards to receive high quality supports and high quality resources like accounting services, benefit plans, human resources consultation, and so on. Membership in the association is voluntary, although some states are asking associations to certify that a microboard is in good standing and following established principles and practices. That's the case in Wisconsin, and Ann and other members of the Wisconsin Microboard Association have been doing great work in terms of establishing a pattern for what those practices are. So now it's helpful to look at the intersection of two models, the microboard and a robust model that we developed a little bit later for developing enduring circles of support, which we call the Star Raft. The Star Raft is a circle of connection and collaboration and support that's anchored in the larger community. And in this picture, it's showing a number of different people and relationships, and the green circle in the lower left right-hand corner is the microboard. In the absence of clear design, a circle can seem like one of those fuzzy ideas that's impossible to implement with any reliability. People have been kind of working on circles of support for a number of years. We know that the idea of a circle is really important, but the image of a circle doesn't give us very much information about how to do the work. Albert Einstein once said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So we knew we needed a model that wasn't quite as simple as a circle. For some time, we'd been looking for a pattern that had all the qualities that we were seeking, of family and friendship and mentoring and many other qualities, that had an understandable step-by-step method for building it, for making invitations and sustaining it over time, a clear sense of direction, and a metaphor that could help people understand the roles and responsibilities involved. And finally, we got a little breakthrough. We were sailing on the Lake of the Woods, and someone invited us to join what was called a star raft for an overnight anchorage. We learned that recreational sailors sometimes tie up in circles called star rafts when they want to anchor in community. And there's a step-by-step process for bringing boats into a circle like this. One of the interesting things about it is that only one person needs to know how to do it. But once people have been invited in and anchored up in the star raft, everybody who's been there now knows how to do it. We thought it might be a useful metaphor for the circles we were trying to build. It occurred to us that the circle of people, was like this, the circle of boats. The sailing star raft is based on a nautical tradition of hospitality, people sharing connections and what they carry on board. And we think their connections are our connections in community, and what we carry on board are our interests, our gifts, our skills, our capacities, the things that we strive for. Helping new sailors learn the ropes, deciding how to manage any hazards up ahead, identifying interesting places to visit. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes, and planning the next adventure together. The star raft starts with an invitation, and it's built one boat, one conversation at a time. So part of the lesson there is that this is in the realm of invitation and hospitality rather than in the realm of eligibility and competition. Each new person brings new opportunities, insights, connections, and capacities. Dee Yost and Cindy Kernan in Wisconsin were teaching me that a couple of years ago. They said, David, don't wait until somebody's ready to leave. Keep a flow of new members coming in, because it opens up new possibilities and adds energy.
I can't tell it all.
So we've got one live mic somewhere. Each person has different interests and standing in different places. Al had standing with the person who owned the radio station. So more opportunities show up. And the shape creates a space in the middle where it's safe to swim, because everyone's in view and everyone's also within reach. And thinking about that in terms of the work of a microboard or a circle, if people are doing their work in companionship with each other, there's greater safety. And people can see and encourage and support one another. They feel accountable to the person at the center and to the group. They see a need for continuity, so they naturally keep adding new people. And there's a sense of energy and creativity and celebration. It's not just work, but there are more people to share the work. The nautical metaphor turned out to offer some interesting ways to think about the roles that need to be fulfilled beyond board membership, which kind of gets us into very administrative kind of space. There's a difference between the owner and the skipper that's interesting. The owner is the person who gets to say where the boat is going. The skipper takes responsibility for getting us there and keeping everyone safe and organizing the contributions of the crew and passengers. If you're single-handing, you're both the owner and the skipper. But in Christopher's microboard, he's the owner. Somebody else might be the skipper from time to time. Same thing with Stuart's microboard. We're always looking for Stuart's expression of a sense of direction and what's working and what's not working. But my guess is that Anne and other people take on the role of skipper from time to time. The navigator is an interesting role because it's the part of the process where we keep meeting, we keep getting together, remembering where we started, where we were going, and where we are now, and making some decisions about, do we need to adjust our course? Do we need to, if we're not heading exactly where we wanted to be going, do we need to be doing something different? And by the way, this is never about criticism or blame. The navigator has a kind of diplomatic immunity. It's helpful to take turns in that role. The radio operator is an easy one to think about. It's somebody who keeps everybody connected and informed about what's going to happen next. It's important to keep a journal, a record that allows us to reflect on our experience, learn from our history, and celebrate how far we've come. So we usually assign somebody to keep a vivid graphic or written or verbal record of the journey. The map maker, it's helpful to have somebody kind of in the background listening for new opportunities, new possibilities as they come up in conversation and making notes about that so that it captures those windows of opportunity before we lose them in the next part of the conversation. And the chief steward, or the hospitality person, is the person who, as Christopher reminded us, if you feed them, they will come. And if we share this job around, mom doesn't have to do all the baking. It means friendliness to guests, a sense of welcome, safety, and comfort and appreciation, but also making sure that the adaptations that somebody needs to be there and to be effective in their presence are provided. The harbor pilot is an interesting item. The harbor pilot's not always there, but when we're trying, when someone actually recently said, I want to be part of Toastmasters, we got somebody from Toastmasters into the meeting so that that person could kind of pilot us in to the Toastmasters, somebody who already had standing and influence in the Toastmasters. And we've learned to share these jobs around so that everybody ends up with a solid working knowledge of every job and can do those jobs in a pinch and feels confident and competent about what they're doing. One of the things that we'll share as a printout that can be added to the package that'll be coming out to you is a navigation chart that has 12 or 13 or 14 of the central ideas about the work that we're doing at any given time. We'll touch on those in a few seconds. Because the Star Raft includes a very clear descriptions about what we're asking people to do and step-by-step instructions for making those invitations. Introduce us to people whom you already know and trust and who already know and trust you. Remember that story about Alan and Scott and the radio station operator. That's how it happened. Systematically identify and mobilize the gifts and the capacities of the person at the center. And then follow the threads of those interests and gifts in the direction of connection and companionship and contribution, and be systematic about that. Look for what Faye calls the sweet places in the community. They're places that operate on the basis of cooperation rather than competition. They tend to be small, and they systematically identify and mobilizes everyone's contribution. When I was in a habitat build I guess 25, 30 years ago now in Winnipeg, they let me be on the board of directors because I had some knowledge about how to do that. But when it came to building, they let me carry wood because I wasn't real good with power tools at that time. Be in relationship, become part of that person's life and welcome him as part of yours. Make an agreement to be tied in for a while. Bring other trusted people into the picture and make and keep agreements on what my boys call major safeties, balancing what's important to and what's important for the person. That's one of the bylines in the essential lifestyle planning, the ELP method of person-centered planning. This is a rock wall about 1,000 yards off the coast from where we live. And one of the cardinal rules is you never do this kind of diving alone, because if you get in trouble, there's nobody to get you out of trouble. And it's such an important role that you can actually lose your ticket to dive if you violate that rule in this kind of environment. Serve as a connector to the community spaces in which you already have standing. And remember that everybody in every one of these places, Toastmasters, a drumming group, a sailing group, a habitat build, every one of these people can lend their connections to anyone else. So every thread we follow, if we keep attending to who's there, where they're connected, what they carry on board, leads here to this very complex, very rich environment of family and friends and associations and skills and workplaces, learning places, community places. So again, how these tie together, all microboards start with that circle made up of family members, friends, and community partners. And by the way, the circle is so important that it can be operated well in advance of anybody forming a microboard. All of these things, all the benefits of a circle don't have to wait for a microboard to be the focus, the topic. All of us, one way and another, live in the meantime. And the meantime is while the state is moving in the direction of more person-centered services and solutions, we can always be forming these circles. At any given time, a few members of that circle serve as directors of the Microboard Corporation, but other members might serve in additional roles like supported decision-making partners, financial trustees, formal representation agreement partners, and so on. One of the reasons there's that differentiation is we were talking to one dad in one of the northeastern states who wanted financial trusteeship and guardianship inside the microboard. And we said it should be inside the microboard, but separate from the circle. So there's a kind of natural beneficial tension between the representation agreement and financial trusteeship and the work of the microboard. Circle members can also assist the person in being successful as a renter or owner of his or own home or in customized employment. And again, think about Al and Scott and the radio station person. So the little illustration for that would be a radio station antenna instead of a factory. But Al knew somebody who had presence in that place. Taken all together, these elements create a unified, continuing pathway to a good life, and it's one that works in cooperation and collaboration with elements of the formal service system. So we think about it as a unified, person-centered, family-friendly, community-based solution. And that looks like it's complicated because we're trying to reach all of these elements of a good life. But there's a long history now of people doing this and doing it well. Vela Microboard Association in British Columbia is providing good experience in terms of principles and functions for microboards. And they have over 2,000 microboards operating in BC because government realized that this was working for the people and for the government. In Wisconsin, Ann Rabin and other people are working on very important developments in terms of self-assessment and reporting functions in terms of microboard development and operation. The Georgia Microboard Association has developed a board training handbook where all of those, where that's being shared with other microboards. We're actually sponsoring a monthly meeting of people who are doing microboards and circle building work, and they're now sharing their resources on Zoom like we are today. The Illinois Association of Microboards and Cooperatives is doing some important new work, and there'll be a few announcements about that soon. Community vision is an example of a different approach, but with a similar kind of of idea and a similar kind of activism. Community Vision is a small provider organization in Portland, Oregon, that is literally moving in the direction of helping each person it supports get control of the resources, responsibilities, and accountabilities involved in managing their own services. So it is actually possible for forward-looking agencies to make this kind of move. And in fact, that's how Vela Microboard Association got started. Linda Perry was running 4 4-bed group homes, and she basically turned it inside out. She made a deal with the government that people could continue to receive the funding, but create solutions for everybody on a separate basis. So real quick, recommended general strategies that states and providers can use to support these kinds of solutions. Hopefully the state can approve microboards as fully qualified service providers and support the development of circles and similar solutions, assist agencies in converting to person-centered enterprises, separate housing from the provision of supported living services so that people can change services without losing their house, or change houses without losing their services. And the same idea applies in terms of separating the provision of places of employment from the provision of employment support services. But here's what we need in terms of building and supporting infrastructure for generating these kinds of person-centered solutions at a local basis. And I think about this as a kind of highways project. People who are driving on the highways don't have to build the highways. The state builds the highways in advance. And what we're suggesting that states not only should do, but can do, is to support the development of independent local sources for person-centered planning and in training and person-centered facilitation, microboard development support, Star Raft or support circle training and facilitation. And we've actually crafted a pattern for doing that, both in the places that are already doing that, but in a kind of major new initiative that'll be announced soon. And developing and supporting independent local capacity for delivering representation agreements as an alternative to guardianship, total discretionary trust, special needs trusts, home of one's own solutions, and customized employment. Those are the nuts and bolts. The spirit is that what we're looking for is, if it turns out to start looking like this picture, and Anne and Stuart's and the Raven family's team, we know that we're getting there if there's this kind of collaboration and happiness. If it ends up looking like this, if we start to see qualities that look like this, that give us this sense of collaboration and accomplishment, we know that we're getting to where we want to be. And that's that. So I'm going to stop the share, and Bevan, it's back to you.
Great. Thank you, David, and all. And thank you to all of the participants who are blowing up our chat box with all kinds of excellent questions. Feel free to keep them coming, and we have a good amount of time. So I think we'll be able to get to quite a few of our questions. I've already called out quite a number that have come in during the presentations. So I'm going to start with those, and we'll see how far we get. So first, David, I'd like to start back with you, and just wondering if you can provide us just with a little more a few folks wrote in wanting just a little more concrete, tangible details about what these microboards look like in practice. So I've sort of called out a few questions that hopefully will get us there, and feel free to add anything else that you'd like that would just help to kind of, for people who are unfamiliar with this model, to kind of wrap their heads around it. But the first question is, how are microboards in the United States funded? What types of funding do they receive from the state? And what does the funding pay for?
Okay. Thanks. That's really good. They are first of all, the microboards are small nonprofit. They're not charitable, but they're nonprofit corporations, and because they have the same kind of standing as other conventional provider agencies, the funding that many microboards are using to engage and employ their support staff is funded by the state through a Medicaid waiver or through, it differs from one place to another, but it's essentially moving the kind of state funding that would go to, one or more or many provider organizations in a community. It's moving that funding directly to the microboard. Kathleen Meyer is asking, does the microboard need to incorporate? There are microboards that haven't incorporated, but in many cases, in order for the state to identify the microboard as a provider agency, they do need to incorporate. But it's not a tough incorporation. It's a small incorporation. Sometimes 3, 4, 5, depending on what the state regulations are for incorporation. The IRS doesn't make the corporations eligible for charitable status because they are serving just one person. But we have microboards in a number of places that are aligned with other charitable groups that can receive funding and provide additional supports to the microboards. The other thing is that we didn't want microboards just like to have to go and have bake sales in order to support the people that they're supporting. So we're still making the kind of claim that any other organization is making for the rightful support of on public funds.
Okay, great. That was very helpful, David. And now I'd actually like to see maybe turn to Team Honeycutt and describe sort of from Team Stuart's perspective, sort of how they got up and running with their microboard, working with Iris, and we'll circle back to that momentarily. But first I thought I might turn things over to Team Honeycutt if you could maybe just walk us through sort of how you got your microboard in Georgia up and running.
We started as a circle of support for Christopher, a little less formalized than the microboard, but a group of people who knew and cared about him. And we gathered periodically over food of various types and various spices. But as it turns out, that was the basis for bringing this idea up. And then other people saying, yeah, this sounds like a pretty good idea. After we did that, we in fact did. I believe that the cost in the state of Georgia was $125. It needs to be renewed each year, and we have renewed each year since that's gone on. And so it's a pretty simple process, actually.
Okay, great. Let's see. Wondering about, we got a question just around staffing, and wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the training that you referenced, that's sort of over and above the standard required training that you'd see for professionals who'd be working with Stuart.
Sure. So we focus on training that really supports the supporters and supports their personal growth as it relates to and benefits Stuart. So we've sent folks on sensory trainings. They can sit in with our independent consultants and see how that process goes. They sit in our nurse oversight reviews and see how that goes. They've attended the culture of gentleness and then bring that back home and share it with the team members and with Stuart and the family. And they have access to both online and written materials, resources, which are specific to Stuart's needs. So we really expand and focus on Stuart and what he needs in various parts of his life.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
And one of the things I might add is on that is something that you were talking with me about a couple of weeks ago, which is you're watching the process of the existing staff not only welcome, but in some ways induct the new staff into the overall understanding and culture and spirit of what everybody's trying to do with in their work. And you might mention something that they added about that.
Sure, that was quite touching. I hear my words coming out of their mouths, which means that, which is telling me that they really kind of got it. And one thing that some of them say when we're bringing in a new person, if it's not for everybody, and if it's not for you, that's fine. You can leave, no hard feelings. So, but they really got the message.
Yeah, thanks, Ann. But by the way, I just see a couple of small questions that I'd like to just touch on really quickly. Are direct service staff employed by the Microboard or by a direct service provider? Generally, the direct service staff are employed by the Microboard because what we want to do is get as close to being able to control who comes in our front door as we possibly can. There are a handful of Microboards that subcontract with a service provider, but they're always in a position to change the contract if the service provider is no longer working to the benefit of the person. Microboard members, another question, Microboard members are never paid for their work on the Microboard for being part of the board of directors. That's just the rule of the nonprofit. Money flows to the Microboard, but also there are several instances where the state is providing financing to the Microboard associations for the technical support and training and organizational support that the Microboards are getting. And that's it. Oh, somebody says, are Microboards held to the same scrutiny and oversight as traditional provider agencies? Having accreditation cost $10,000 plus before any service is delivered. It's interesting because they are so small that they actually, that they are likely to qualify for a level of scrutiny that doesn't occur until an agency is of a certain size. And on the other hand, we have a very, very strong commitment to supporting and respecting the state's legitimate interests in public accountability. So Microboards aren't resisting that kind of scrutiny, but we often sort of get slightly under the radar of the things that would require an organization serving 200 people. It works better.
So David, I also noticed sort of a grouping of questions, really wondering kind of what's the difference between Microboards and other self-directed models. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, thanks. Two things. One is that there is a strong definition of Microboards that was developed between us and Vela Microboard Association. And the term Microboard is actually trademarked by Vela. And one of the reasons for that is that Vela was trying to protect the Microboard from from becoming sort of distorted over time. So Vela has established, and we have established, for example, some of the work that Anne is doing in Wisconsin about what microboards are, about operating principles, operating guidelines, and how we know when they're working according to those principles and practices and guidelines. When there are things like self-directed support corporations, which and there are a number of those, there's not necessarily the same kind of oversight and qualification or certification. So self-directed support corporations can look, the practices can be much more diverse. We're not against diversity in the practices, but there's a bit more control over what a microboard looks like as if it wants to call itself a microboard. Okay. Microboards use, this is microboards similar to maps planning. Microboards use a whole variety of different planning methods, including path, person-centered planning, maps, essential lifestyle planning, and so on. So the microboard is a mechanism for delivering and organizing support services rather than it's separate from the planning function itself. Bevan, your mic is muted.
Okay, there were another set of questions around, let's see. Oh, I just got it lost when I got, okay. There were a couple other questions. I just wanted to come back to employment because that came up a number of times. Can you just clarify, are the direct service staff employed? I have a kind of series of questions. Are staff employed by the microboard or by a service provider?
That varies from one place to another, from one instance to another. Generally, our idea is that staff are employed by the microboard, that the microboard is the employer of record. In some cases, the microboard might subcontract with an existing service provider. In other cases, the microboard is operating in a less formal way, and the person is still receiving some or all of their services from a traditional service provider. So it does vary, but our basic intention was that that microboards would have the capability of being the employer of record. That came clear for us. Faye and I invented the model about 30 years ago, or a little over 30 years ago. We didn't need one until 15 years ago, when our daughter was about to come home from hospital with a whole different set of needs and some incredible fragility. We also knew at that point that we needed more help in our household, but we needed to have absolute control over who was providing supports to us and to her, because she didn't have the margin for error for somebody to get it wrong. And so I remember saying to the person who we first recruited to be a support staff, who knew us and trusted us, and we knew him and trusted him. I was driving him home one day and I said, Rory, you know that the only job security here is that as long as it's working for Amber, it's working. But when it's not working, she literally doesn't have the margin for error for it not to work. And he smiled at me and he said, I wouldn't take this job under any other circumstances. So we needed to have, and at the same time, we need to be, all microboards need, and all families that are engaging people, all individuals need to be fair and ethical and supportive employers and follow all the rules around employment. But we still need to have that element of control. A friend of mine recently switched from provincially provided home care to this kind of direct funding. And in the last 2 months of the provincially provided home care, for very, very personal needs, very, very personal physical needs, he had 50 different people come into his house to provide that kind of support. And when he got this kind of direct funding and this kind of authority, within 2 weeks, that got down to 2 people. And those same 2 people, plus other people that they've recruited for occasional services, has been in place for 5 years. So it made a huge difference in his life.
Another question that I'd like you to respond to is, can you speak to sort of the financial feasibility of this model for lower income people, lower income families, and communities, and speak to kind of how these might be funded for less resourced folks in less resourced communities?
Okay, a couple of thoughts. One actually has to do with the locality, and I wanted to say something earlier about being culturally sensitive and culturally competent, because we've developed an idea that microboard creating enterprises should be very, very local. It means that they can, a microboard development organization can be based in the local language and the local culture. So they're more sensitive that way. Generally, even if the family has very few resources, what we are relying on, what the person is relying on, is state funding for their support services. So what we're talking about is a mechanism for flowing the funding to the microboard instead of to a more conventional agency. The one financial advantage is, and somebody brought that up, I saw it show up in one of the questions, is that the administrative overheads of a microboard are generally very, very small compared to more conventional organizations, because the conventional organizations have to be organized and staffed and funded to provide, to support the needs of people with very diverse needs. And so Anne and Stuart, your microboard needs to be trained and organized and supported to provide for the specific needs and the changing requirements that Stuart represents. It doesn't have to be organized to provide for that huge diversity of needs if you were serving 15 people or 150 people. So administratively, the overheads are much smaller. That being said, we still depend on and are happy to pay for good accounting services, good payroll services, good HR services. But we do that through the association.
Great. This question, I'm wondering if, Anne, you might be able to help us out with. Someone's wondering if a person is wondering, actually, perhaps, Anne, everyone can kind of pitch in on this one, wondering about specific examples of how supports for living in the community is arranged. So maybe folks could, on Team Christopher and Team Stuart, could kind of talk about any, daily living supports and how those are arranged. And then another part of the question is, if a person is renting their own home without family in the community, if you know of anybody who uses 24-hour supports.
Sure. Well, Stuart needs 24-hour supports. He lives within our home in his own apartment. It's private. He's got his own garage. We staff throughout the day, and then as family, we cover overnights. And what was the other part of your question?
Really looking at different arrangements. So, and particularly around the 24 hours. So it sounds like for you guys, you've got a mix of family and paid staff. For
Yes.
support.
Every microboard does things differently based upon the needs of the individual. Some folks, they do job training, or they may have a job. They have recreation activities. They are, in the home. It all depends on the person at the center to how those supports are put in place.
Great.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Team Christopher, about living supports? Is that something you've worked with through your microboard?
What I would offer, Bevan, is that Christopher has a stream of income through SSI. So that is designed to provide for his living, if you will. I'm going to suggest that probably some of the individuals for whom listeners are focused would have SSI available too, and that could be used for residential supports.
Mhm.
In Georgia, there is an additional stream of revenue that is essentially for people who, without that, would be committed to an institution. And if you are waived from institutional assignment, then you have some income that's available to you in the community, but that's only for services. It's not at all for any residential sorts of things. And then finally, for Christopher, his jobs provide him with money for other things. In his condo, he buys his own groceries, those sorts of things. He pays for his own utilities, that kind of thing. So essentially, if you look at these pots of money, so to speak, some of them can be used for one thing, others of them can be used for another, and depending on how those are parceled up, you may have some need for other income, other revenue from other sources. Now, if I can drop back to a question that David answered so confidently, is that you need to realize that money for the microboard isn't really for any purpose other than the support of the focus person. Since none of the board members are being paid, unless we're hiring accountants or unless we're hiring HR people, those sorts of things, there's not other expenses that are going on. Now, certainly when we have a board meeting, we buy pizzas, but those are the kinds of things that we kind of share costs on, and that's easily enough done. But by virtue of the way the board is set up, there's not a lot of inherent cost that's associated with it. And so if someone comes into this thing with, I might be a part of the microboard, but I'm not sure whether you're going to be wanting contributions from you, that's not happening,
Mm-hmm.
at least in our board. And so people can come on board and, be real happy with they're helping make decisions about money that's particularly designated for Christopher's support and care.
Got it. Thank you for that. That's great. That's great detail. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. I will say right now, I'm certain that we will not get to all of the fantastic questions that folks have asked. But luckily we can work with our presenters to compile answers to the questions that you have asked. We have record of them all in chat, so never fear. if we don't get to your question today, we will email you when we have written answers available, and those will be publicly posted. I do want to visit two groupings of questions before we close, if that's all right. And David, you may be the lead on this, but please, Team Christopher and Team Stuart, feel free to chime in. The first is around where can people find out about whether or not there's a microboard association in their area, whether or not people have created microboards in their states. Where can people go to find more local information about microboards? And David, you are on mute.
That's a really good question. We have a little list, but I want to raise that question with the group of microboards and circle builders that meet on the first Wednesday of every month, and we will get back to you about that. We think that there are a couple of other states that either have or have a history of having microboard associations. But the ones that we are on the call are most directly familiar with are Illinois, Wisconsin, British Columbia, Georgia, and some of the spin-offs from the Vela Microboard Association in BC. So that's a good question, and we need to start taking inventory about that. So we'll get back to you through NCAPS. So the other thing is I see a set of questions that are coming up around. Is the only way that a microboard can get created through a microboard association? Anybody in any state could probably try incorporating their own microboard and establishing a contract with the state. But it really, in our view, it really helps to have to develop a microboard association that develops the competency and capacity to generate this model on a reliable basis. Most of those microboard associations are small and voluntary. Ann Rabin and Ruth Addicks and Dee Yost and a small group of people have been doing that in Wisconsin for some time now and have developed a tremendous amount of expertise doing it. So that there is a place where families in Wisconsin or individuals in Wisconsin who want to move in this direction can now go and get the kind of supports they need. By the way, Zoom is a really great addition to this because it means that people don't have to be traveling 4 hours each way to have a conversation with a family. So they're being really creative about using a combination of virtual and on-site supports. But the other reason that we're hoping for a statewide association, not just to be developing individual microboards, but to be developing local development teams, is that the local people have, first of all, have standing and trust in their local community, but they're also knowledgeable about their local community. Incidentally, I hope that we got across the idea that this works equally well for people with very complex, very significant, very challenging needs as it does for people with, who present different kinds of opportunities and different kinds of requirements. It works well across age, across the kind of category that folks live with. And incidentally, somebody asked about aging supports. This can work perfectly for people who need supports to age in place or to age in the community. I come from some experience in child welfare, and I would love to see this kind of solution partly microboards, but also strongly this idea of circles of support developed for kids in the child welfare system, so they just don't get dumped off the edge of the cliff when they turn 18 and a half.
Well, thanks, David. And yeah, and I think stay tuned in the written questions and answers, because we got a number of questions around sort of transferability of this model to population. So we'll look forward to delving in that deeper with the written responses as well. But we have reached the end of our hour and a half. I'd like to ask Sabrina to pull up our real-time evaluation questions in this very last minute of the webinar. If you would, please. Answer the 7 questions that just popped up on your screen before you sign off and go about your day. And then really the last thing for me to do is give a very warm thank you to David Weatherow, to Team Christopher and Team Stuart for sharing your work, your stories. I personally learned a lot. Based on the questions, folks listening and learned a lot too, and we thank you for that. So please tune in to future NCAPS webinars. You'll be receiving some follow-up emails from us when the recordings, slides, and other resources are available. And hope to see all of you again next month on our next webinar, which will be focused on cultural competence and person-centered practices. So take care, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
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 Thanks, David.